My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
And today, part 2 of the Felipe Smith conversation about taking over Japanese comics. And I implore everybody who has not seen part 1 of the conversation, click the link in the description below this video. Check that out. But Felipe, if you're good, I remember exactly where we left off, man, and we could just pick up that thread right away.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so what we were talking about was, and we left the conversation off with, you sort of shook your head to the affirmative that when it comes to the collected editions of PEEPO CHOO out there in Japan, the first 2 came out together, and based on conversations I had with mangaka, they all make sure that they take the time to adjust some of the art that goes into the tankobon. So you shook your head to the affirmative. Yes, you changed some pages, but I want to stress and sort of get into the part where, you know, it's the first 2 tankobon that are out and you're adjusting pages for that. But you still have that same grueling monthly schedule on the serialized part of the comic, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So how much time on top of your already grueling deadlines where you're going to sleep with a lamp in your face so that you don't accidentally sleep 3 hours instead of 2 or something?
Right.
With that schedule, like how much time did you have to redraw pages, and how many pages, you know, off the top of your head, can you remember that you redrew? Or on top of that schedule? It's insane.
Actually, I didn't have a lot of time to redraw pages, so I didn't do much. What I did was correct tones and certain things like that you miss, and then when you see it printed for the first time, you want to kill yourself. Like, you know, like just the file will slide over, or like you'll have something layered wrong, and so it just doesn't look right. It's usually the type of thing that the creator, you know, like we can tell, but most people don't see it unless it's like someone who's like really, really picky and looks at stuff very carefully, which, you know, those people are around as well. So in terms of redrawing pages, I didn't really get to redraw anything completely. I didn't, as you said, like you don't have time for that. I mainly fixed tones. Sometimes if like a background wasn't right, it was things that I could fix within like, you know, a couple minutes, rather than like have a full day of just drawing and fixing my comic book. So like, as I told you guys last time, like when I look at PEEPO CHOO, I remember what it was like doing it. And even though some pages I don't remember drawing them, which I also mentioned to you, but for the most part, it was me drawing in a hurry, sometimes drawing full, just ink without an underdrawing, without pencil or anything, just to make it. So I kind of try not to focus too much on that when I look at it, but I'm not like the happiest with most of it. Story-wise, it's cool. I mean, I think this is everybody, so I don't know why I'm even mentioning that. You can stop there, you get it.
One interesting thing there, you know, you mentioned how fast you're drawing those pages. It seems like that's probably true of most mangaka working at that similar pace. There's such an energy in manga, and I wonder if that's a side effect of like drawing at that pace of like, man, the deadline, I've got 4 days to do 20 pages here. I wonder if that's part of, you know, what's built into that artwork, because it does often, part of what I like about a lot of the manga I read is that sense of, I don't know, speed, movement, dynamicism. You know, it really feels like it's moving as a reading experience. I wonder if that's a side effect of just working that fast.
I believe it is. There's an urgency to a lot of this stuff, and you can tell. Of course, a lot of the more established mangaka, because they're doing their inze sekai, which means like their royalty living, which means that they pay out all their page rates to their assistants, and they can afford to have more than one assistant because they're already making royalties off of their books. Those artists tend to, besides having a lot more time and experience doing a series and actually making it to the point where they have enough assistants to just focus on like more of the name stuff and the character stuff, eventually those creators also find a groove and you feel less of that urgency. But definitely like rookies, you can see that a lot, especially with the you know, shinjin mangaka, like the rookies. You're still trying to figure out your system. The way it was for me was I had one assistant and I could only afford him for 7 days out of the month. So what I would do is I'd do all the name. Once that got approved, then I would start doing all the layouts. And what I would do is like, I would plan the 7 days, and they would usually be around the end of me turning in my chapter, and I would get together backgrounds for the assistant to ink, or just get the pages ready to tone. And then when he would check in, I would give him stuff, and I'd see like, okay, we need this done. And the crazy thing is, well, it's not crazy, that's just the way the system works, but assistants, my assistant would come over to my apartment in Hikawadai. So I would pay for the assistant's transportation, and then I would pay for his meal. And because I was, again, I didn't have royalties coming in, so I was like, really had, just my page rate to live off of. So I would end up cooking for my assistant every day that he came in, those 7 days. And so it was crazy, because I would be up until probably like 5 or 6 in the morning drawing stuff and getting stuff ready for the assistant to work on. Because if the assistant showed up and I had nothing for him to do, I still got to pay him, but also we're not moving. I'm just losing money. So I would get the pages ready for the backgrounds to be toned, or the pages to be toned, and I would do that digitally. And then I would start cooking rice, and then I'd like go to the grocery store and like get like lettuce and tomatoes and stuff to make salad. And so like I ended up like working for the assistant basically, so that the assistant could work on the comic while I couldn't. I was doing stuff in order to have the assistant there. Like it's strange, because the days before the assistant showed up, like I had tons of stuff to do besides just my comics. Like I had to make sure like he was fed, that I had like the cash ready for him before he left, so I didn't have to like go to the bank and get that stuff. That's all like, I guess, like extra work that you don't think about when you're doing a comic. You're just like, oh, well, do I have the dialogue down? Cool. What perspective do I want this from? All right, that's cool. I'll just start drawing. Like I had to think about like other stuff too. Eventually, the assistant realized that he had a computer at home, and he could do the tones from home. And that made things easier, because I didn't have to like do all this work, this extra work for him. He could just eat at home and do his own thing. And he didn't have to get on the train, which was, beneficial for him too, which meant he could sleep in a little later. The other thing that drove me nuts, this is a cultural thing for you guys about Japan, is that people believe on being on time, right? So like the way you are on time in Japan is you show up early. So if I said, okay, let's start at 10, that means that until like 9:59, I'm doing other shit. Like I'm not ready until 10. So I can't even like open the door. Why? Because like I just took a shower, and now I'm like setting up the rice, and I got to get the files ready. Like I can't have somebody showing up at 9:45, but that's exactly what the assistant did. So I have to tell him like, hey, like give me 2 seconds, I'm not ready yet. Eventually he explained to me, he said, oh, in Japan, it's seen as a positive thing to show up extra early, just to let the other person know you care and you're a serious person and you're down, And this isn't just for like comics, it's for like anything. Like if you have an appointment, you show up early. What I normally do is I try to show up exactly on time. If it's 10 o'clock, I try to be there. I'll wait outside, even if I'm there 15 minutes. I'll just show up at 10 to not, in Argentina where I grew up, if you have a party and you say it starts at 10, people show up at 11:30. So, and it's also a culture. If you showed up early like you do in Japan to a party in Argentina, people would be like, what's wrong with this person? Like, we said 10. We meant 11:30, damn it. So like those things also, I had to get used to over there. Once you learn those things, you realize. So I told them like, yeah, just get here. I know you're serious and it's not an issue. Just like get here. If you can get here at 10, I'd appreciate it, because before 10, I'm not even ready.
Were you connected with the assistant through Kodansha? How did you meet this person?
No, and that's another thing. I think people who want to draw comics in Japan and love manga assume that the publisher just kind of sets you up with a team of manga mercenaries that just kill it and make your series awesome. And like, no, that's not the case. You have to look for your assistants by yourself. And sometimes some publishers have contacts. They'll try to like pair you up with either creators they know. Like if you're an artist and you don't write your own stuff, which is actually in the minority in Japan,
right?
If they have a writer they want to work with who doesn't draw, sometimes they'll do pairings, but that's not a common thing. It's not like Marvel or DC where they're like, all right, we got this writer, we got this artist. What do you guys think? Like, we think you guys should do this project. It's not like that. You have to bring in all the content yourself, and you have to bring your own team. In my case, my literary agent, Shina Yukari, would look at forums, and she would say, okay, this person, and she knew, because she was in the industry, just meeting artists and creators, like she knew, she would ask around. So she found different candidates. So I met, I think I met about, let's see, like 4 or 5 different assistants, and there are a couple guys, a couple girls, different ages, and eventually, yeah, I found someone that I could work with that like liked the kind of, understood the kind of stuff I was going for in terms of reference and stuff, and like, and this assistant also had lived in Canada like 3 years or something like that. So he spoke a little English too, and he wanted to practice. And I was like, okay, that's great, because it made things a little easier on my part in terms of like the cultural stuff, because even though I could speak Japanese and I understood like how things work, basically, there's a lot of things. It's called kyotsukau in Japanese, which is you have to really be very mindful of what the other person is thinking or how they might take something you say, and that, your age, and if you're a man or a woman, these things all like have effect on this, right? And so like having to think, trying to do 60 pages in a month, trying to do most of it, and arrange for 7 days for this person to help me finish this chapter on time, besides a bunch of other stuff, was enough for me to worry about. That also worrying about whether I'm offending the assistant by calling him, by his name instead of like an honorific or something like that. It was just too much for me to deal with. And it's real. Like you can offend your assistant, and then like they just won't show up, or like, they'll have a problem, or they'll hate you. So they'll work, they won't put as much effort into it or whatever. Like these are things that comic book artists deal with their assistants. Then there's like a whole bunch of other stuff. Some comic book artists are so, they're so busy and they never leave their house. They end up having relationships with an assistant, which is not ideal if you ever break up with your assistant, or if it gets confusing. So like those are things I would hear talk about when like these mangaka would drink, and then they'd like be real frank about their situation. And so like they would say, oh man, like I messed up, or like, just all sorts of stuff that a lot of times I would think, wow, that wouldn't even be divulged, because people are so careful to reveal anything personal that might offend or whatever. But then like once the drinks go down, like it's just like, everything comes out. I think it's also definitely in Japan, it's a form of it's a way of releasing your stress. I think a lot of people, drinking is something where once you drink, socially it's accepted to kind of say the truth and maybe be like a little bit offensive, but you've got the excuse of the drinking, so people can't hold that against you. And so I would see that. I would see, like creators yelling at editors, or like editors like yelling at their superiors and like getting like buck wild, where you're like, yo, like this guy is fired, and like, nah, like it's just like it never happened the next day. And I think it's also a way where, again, this is me as a Westerner analyzing all this stuff. And I mean, you could feel free to ask any Japanese person you meet, and I think they might be surprised that, I mean, I would always get, they would tell me they're surprised that as a Westerner I picked up on these things. But I don't know. I mean, as someone who writes stories about people and the reason why they do things and like their behavior and their motivations and stuff, it's all like not only interesting to me, I can't avoid noticing these things, So
I've had that conversation with other cartoonists. I remember talking to Jaime Hernandez about it at one point, and you have to be observant, probably compared to your average person. You sort of have to do that for all the reasons that you said. If you're making up stories and making up characters, it's kind of where you're drawing your references from, is just seeing how people behave and interact. And
yeah, totally. And that's what I find. I mean, that's what I find excites me the most about making comics, is when I can. And I mean, when I say when I can put like realistic elements or things from my experience into them, whenever I'm doing my own work, that's mostly what I do, regardless of what like the theme is or the storyline. Like I'm just trying to put in things that like really had an impact on me personally, or things that I can't believe are happening or whatever. When you do stuff, when you do work for hire, it really depends on the publisher, whether they understand where you're coming from and what you have to offer story-wise, where they're like, you know what, yeah, just deviate from what we normally do, like do your thing, like we trust you. Obviously, we would see a lot more different work in mainstream comics if that was the case. Publishers usually have a certain kind of work they want to put out, and so you go along those lines. So you'll find more of what I'm talking about in indie stuff. But in Japan, a mainstream publisher will want exactly that. So your point of view and how it's very interesting, because in Japan, if you just in a conversation, if you give an opinion that's not popular or might offend someone, it's like a big no-no. So people are very careful to like navigate socially without doing those things, right? As much as they can. But when it comes to being a creator in a comic book, these people who are also Japanese end up being like crazy subversive and just doing stuff where people are like shocked, and it does really well, and it's popular, and people buy it because of that reason, because it's like, taboo in a way, like a lot of the behaviors of these characters. And it's kind of strange how, when you meet with your editor and stuff, you're still in Japan and a Japanese person, and this isn't your comic. Now this is life, so you're a certain way. But then you reveal a lot in the comic. Like, I remember, to explain what I just said, and in case it was confusing, I read a lot of manga before I went to Japan, right? And I guess I looked at more than I read. So I looked at, like, let's say I looked at 100 different books, and I read like maybe like the 25 that I was most into, right? But I was aware of what was out there and the types of storytelling and what was being done. And what I thought was, I always associated the content with the creator, and I'm like, man, this person must be insane. This person's a lunatic, or this person's hilarious. Like, I'm going to talk to this person, and it's going to be nothing but laughter, like 3 hours straight. And then I had the fortune of meeting some of these creators, and they were like, in some cases, the opposite of what I inferred from their comic books. Like, if their comic books are like super dynamic, over the top, like just subversive and just crazy, and I'm like, yo. And then I meet this person, and they'd be the most mild-mannered, quiet, shy person ever. And I thought, how does that make sense? And then I realized, like, a lot of what we see in anime and manga that's like really we're drawn towards, and it seems way more expressive than Western comics, where people are way more expressive than people in Asia. If you just flip through like American TV shows and watch people just talking like regular people, like people on like a reality TV show or something, or someone they pull off the street, someone like Jay Leno pulls off the street for his jaywalk questions, or he used to, that he's not even on air, but he would just ask anybody about something like, what do you think about what the president said about, like, eating chocolate cake? And they're like, oh man, that's crazy. And like, people are just characters here in comparison. But you go over there and people are like, do deshoka? Yeah, mada wakanai. Like, people are way more like subdued. They're way more thoughtful about what they're going to answer, regardless of whether they're on TV or not. And so these creators, I think, use comics as a medium to get all that energy out there, to be like super expressive, in a way that, like, I find that in comics here, we see it way less often. Characters seem to be like, they have more of a stoic attitude. They're quiet. They're kind of, again, I don't know where that might come from, like Westerns and like older mediums that like reflected something heroic, and whatever the case may be. I think what we see in these comics, we're not seeing a reflection of the creator as much as what are like the standard norms of what we see here. And I think in Japan, they kind of, when it comes to comics, you can do a lot more. You can get crazier. You can kind of be yourself. Outside of comics, in society, not so much. Dang. Over here, you can have your opinion and be like, I hate that movie. That movie's garbage. And people are like, well, they like it, but they're not going to get so deeply offended. No, I'm lying. Some people might be like, how dare you? That's my favorite. But again, it's just the the number of people doing one thing or the other changes drastically depending on the culture.
I got to hang out with your literary agent, Miss Sheena, while I was out there, and she gained me access to the Kodansha offices. Got to hang out at Morning Magazine and all of that. But the coolest part of that little trip was going down to that basement archives at Kodansha. Did you ever get a chance to go down there? And if so, what were you looking through, man? Because they have one copy of everything, and the stuff that I was looking at, the stuff is hardbound as well. So I was looking for OG Young Magazine installments that had like the first Akira like serialized stuff, and there would be 4 volumes of Young Magazine to one hardback, glued into a hardback book, man. So I was like looking through that stuff. Did you get down there?
No, I did not. Things were brought up from there. I was told about it, but like I never got a tour of it or anything. They're just like, get back to work, dude. Like,
here's one of the crazy things. After everything you just said about like the tankobon and redrawing the pages and stuff, one of the main reasons like I got down there was because right before we hit Kodansha, there's that university that's not too far away. It's a little cab ride away, and it's the guy, I forget his name. I apologize, but he's the dude who.
Was it Waseda University?
I think so, and it was the guy who created Comiket, and his entire archive, because he's also a literary critic. His entire archive was at that university, and we were going through all of his stuff, and we found that first Young Magazine that has the early Akira pieces, and there were at least in that first installment. There was at least 2 or 3 pages that are not in the collection that we have. So like when we went to Kodansha, and I brought it up because it like blew my mind when we were down in that archive, like that was the mission. And dude, I saw about 100 pages at the very least that Otomo drew in the serialized joint that is not in the collected books. And there are certain 100 pages at least. But I mean, that's what I saw.
Right. Were they? Do you know, by any chance, if they were a part of the main Akira story, or if they were like a yomikiri, like a short story, like insert?
It was definitely the Akira characters, because there was some cool shit with Tetsuo blowing up dudes' heads and stuff, and it's just different in the comic. Like these sequences were even in color, and in the collected volumes that we have. It's just pen and ink, black and white illustration, and the sequence is a little bit different. Insane.
Who knows? Also, you know what? It might have been something where that's the first thing he did, and then for the collected tankobon series, he's like, "Yo, let's just redo this part." Some creators get crazy like that. They'll if the publisher like is cool with it and they're like, all right, let's do it or whatever, it depends on how much clout the creator has, but because I've seen series where it was a short story, it was a collection of short stories that became one tankobon, and then they just got a series off of that, and then it started again and it got modified somehow, and then that's what you're used to, and you never even see this one. Like I think Gorosha Ichi, like I think Ichi the Killer. I read the series. It's one of the first series I read in Japanese, and like it blew my mind because I don't know if you guys are familiar. Like the movie, in my opinion, again, anything I say is my opinion, so just don't take it as like the truth. But like that Mike Takashi movie, the Ichi the Killer movie, like does no justice to the series. The stuff that happens in it, it's gory and it's like over the top, and it's definitely not for everybody. But what that movie failed to do was justify all that violence and gore and insanity. Like the comic book, what was really interesting to me when I read Ichi the Killer was that you see these Yakuza characters doing like heinous, just horrible stuff. But then you actually get like flashbacks or like context about these characters that are doing these things, and you realize why they're doing it, and even though you might not be cool with it, you understand why. like there's the other side of the coin that's explained to you, and you're like, that's why a person beheads someone and does this and that and the other. It's still horrible, but it's not like a villain that just has no motivation other than I'm evil and I'm just a horrible person you never want to meet. This is someone that's like, a lot of people you met could have turned into this if this, that, and the other would have happened. And it was really interesting. And the movie doesn't have any of that. The movie is just, we're all maniacs. We're all going to do this horrible, disgusting shit. And you're never going to know why, and it doesn't matter. And like, that's just, it's kind of a disservice to that comic book. I don't know how I got on that. But anyway, you guys who like saw the movie, you might want to read the comic. You see something different.
Felipe, you mentioned your literary agent, and I'm curious just how PEEPO CHOO comes about, like how you go to Japan, how you pitch it, how you get into the room to pitch it. Can you give us the origins of how you actually started publishing there?
Yeah, I'll try to make it as short as possible. When I was doing MBQ, I did some videos, and I don't know if you guys put links up to like the one in Argentina at the bookstore. Okay. And during that time, everybody was like, you don't know what, and even if you look at the comments on that video, if you look at the first comments, it's a bunch of people saying, who the hell is this guy? Who does he think he is? He doesn't know what he's talking about. His work is in manga. The later ones, they're like, well, after I went, they're like, oh, look at this guy. Like, he was right or whatever. But during that time, it was nothing but people like just talking shit and saying like, I had no idea what I was talking about, and comparing my stuff to like, you know, real manga, like the stuff they liked. And then I got an email from somebody saying, hey, I'm a literary agent in Japan, and I'd like to represent you. Would you be interested in publishing in Japan? And I mean, I was sure that was somebody fucking with me, you know? So like, I thought about it, but then I decided, okay, well, I'll just answer it anyway. Because, you know, I'll just answer politely just in case it's real. But I just assumed it was somebody just hit up my website to be an asshole. And it did turn out to be a real person that was offering me this opportunity. And she had read MBQ, and she had showed MBQ to the editor-in-chief at Kodansha. And he responded positively to it. He's like, hey, like, yeah, I'd like to meet this person. And that was Shimada-san. And luckily, I had already worked at the karaoke. I had learned Japanese, and so I was able to communicate with him because he doesn't speak English. So like, I believe he met with a bunch of creators of original English language manga that year at San Diego. I think it was 2007. And I believe Shina Yukari had introduced them to him as well as me the same way. So we spoke, and luckily I could talk to him just in Japanese. And so I explained to him, and he asked me, okay, well, what story would you write? This was like at a hotel in San Diego, like just at the lobby where everybody sits. This is where I was talking to this editor from Japan. And he said, well, if you were to write for a Japanese audience, what kind of story would you write? And then I told him, well, I'm not interested in writing for a Japanese audience. And he looked at me like, what? And I told him like, yeah, I'm interested in writing for a global audience. I'd like to write something that can entertain a Japanese person or American, an Argentine or a Jamaican. And like, I want everybody to be able to get something out of this. And so, and then so he looked at me and he's like, like, he's like, okay, that's a good answer. So he's like, well, what is it? What is this awesome thing that everybody's going to understand? And so I told him, like, it was a story about cultural misconceptions between East and West, and more specifically between Japan and the US, and how like, it's this otaku from Southside Chicago who loves this anime called PEEPO CHOO. And like, his whole image of what Japan is purely based on this one anime that he loves. And he just wishes he was from Japan, and he just wishes he hadn't been born in the US, because he realizes that somewhere else in the world, there's a population of people that have the same likes as him and the same taste. And he just wishes he was born there. And so on the other side of the globe in Japan, there's a Yakuza named Morimoto Rockstar, and he wears cowboy hats and leather pants with leopard print and cowboy boots, and he's got a Glock, and he's just crazy. And like, he loves American pop culture. He likes movies and music videos and like hip hop and like movies like Scarface. And so like, his idea of what Americans are is also, grossly skewed by just this one thing he's interested in, which I learned that working at the karaoke, that like the Japanese friends that I made, there were some of them that were raised here in the States and had an idea of like American stuff. And then there were others who'd been here for a shorter time and had all these ideas about what things were, but because either their English wasn't good or they just didn't bother to hang out with Americans, they just had these ideas that were like super erroneous. And I'm like, yo, that's not true. And so I also noticed going to my first anime conventions that there were a lot of anime fans that were like, you know, they were speaking in Japanese, but it was Japanese learned from anime. And they sounded really weird because no Japanese person talks like that. And that's the thing, like in PEEPO, Milton, you know, he's convinced he speaks Japanese fluently because he's been watching PEEPO since he was little, and like he knows everything about it, and he's been studying and stuff. And you know, in the story, something else happens. It turns out that, you know, I don't want to give away the story, but yeah, he was wrong about that. You can't base, you know, a country or a culture on like the one thing you like about that country, because that's going to be just one aspect of the country. So like, I remember seeing cosplayers talking in Japanese, and they sounded like cartoon characters, and it would be the equivalent of like if you were from, you know, I don't know, some Cambodia or Iceland or something, and then you learned how to speak English. What language do they speak in Iceland? Not English.
Icelandic.
All right, so let's say Cambodia and another country that doesn't speak English. I need to look later, but I'm assuming they don't speak English, or maybe it's a secondary language. But if you started learning how to speak English by watching Disney movies, and you were like, oh, that's great. Like if you're learning how to speak English from Mickey Mouse and like Goofy and stuff, when you talk to an American, they're gonna think you're a freak. And the same thing is going to happen if you learn Japanese from anime, because those characters are characters. And even though, and this is the other thing that I learned, and it was also part of PEEPO, was when I looked at anime and manga, I thought they're doing it. They're writing about real shit, because these are real places. This is Shibuya and Shinjuku and Kabukicho and Shinjuku and like all these real places, and people are wearing real clothes and they're eating real things. And like sometimes the brand is just a regular brand. And that like struck me. When I first saw manga, I'm like, yo, I want to do that. I want to write about real life. But then as I was able to read more and more, the behavior of those characters in those comics and the things they say, in my opinion, as a Westerner, they're not very Japanese. They're just fictional characters. They don't behave the way a standard Japanese person would in that scenario. And that's what makes it interesting over there. But that's what, like, I found... I assumed wrong. I wrongly assumed that they were telling like slice of life, straightforward human stories. And in many cases they do, but in others, just because the setting is real and all the names and characters and everything that's happening is real, it doesn't mean that these characters are depicting life in Japan just because it takes place in Japan. And that was like a huge eye-opener to me, because I realized tons of these things are just not realistic, even though it's in a realistic setting. Anytime a character pulls out a gun in any manga or anime and starts shooting, and it happens in Tokyo, people don't own guns in Tokyo. So that would never happen. And people don't know how to react to those things either, because it's not an option. Like police officers have had guns in Japan maybe a little bit over 2 decades, maybe 3 decades at most. So, you know, all these things all of a sudden are really unrealistic. Like, and I tried to explain this to like my editor. Like I was interested in reality, in like showing an audience a situation they might not be familiar with, or might make them uncomfortable or like excited or scared, but make it real. Like if you were here, this could happen, is something I was interested in personally when telling a story, right? If you go into a bus and, you know, you sit down and then somebody next to you has a gun, that's something that could happen to you here in the States. And it does happen to some people. And some people get robbed like that, or people get shot wherever. Those are all scenarios that realistically in Japan, they're not going to happen. So when you see it in a comic, if that's not realistic, they're reading it differently. When I realized that, I was like, oh man, like a lot of the stuff that I normally rely on when telling a story for a Western audience, I can't use, because I can't assume these people would understand or know how they would feel in this situation, because it would never happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a whole lot. And PEEPO, it is the perfect metaphor for like for anyone's like first trip to Japan, who isn't like so well studied or anything like that, because, you know, I had my preconceived notions of what I was in for. And I studied up a lot to just try to make sure that I wasn't an ignoramus gaijin doing all the wrong things or whatever. But it was rap music that brought me out there. You know, like I was connected with a bunch of Japanese rappers. So
nice.
So when I went to their spot, you know, one of the mangaka, man, his mangaka name is Ghetto Hollywood, and he had Harmony Korine posters like the movie Kids. So he just thought that we all, you know, like fuck when we're 13 years old here and smack each other in the head with skateboards whenever we have a grievance or some shit. And it was like, nah, it ain't like that, man. But Felipe, one of the things that I discovered hanging out with a lot of mangaka was that it's like a lot of people, they don't really value original art the same way, like and this is from the mangaka perspective. They don't value original art in the same way that we do, where it's you know, it's could be a part of our business model here in the States, you know, like flip pages and make some loot that way. In some instances, it went so far that not only did the mangaka throw the art away when it was finished, but he also didn't want people roaming around his trash bin, so he actually like shredded it and then put it in the trash, man. So how did you handle your art? And can you tell us some stories of things, anecdotal things that you've heard others do with their artwork or anything like that? Any insight into the original Genko?
Yeah, like I think a lot of people, because you have to, you know, Jim had mentioned earlier that you know, your work, there's an immediacy to your pages because you got to get them out. So I think a lot of people aren't really happy with their Genko. The other thing is their Genko isn't always like this nice, like cardstock paper that's been carefully inked and it's got like, you know, splashes of white on it and it's just this thing you can hang up. It's not, man. It's really not. Like my originals for PEEPO are all drawn on Xerox paper. And like they're not, and sometimes they're covered with another sheet. I tried to be clean about it just because it was less work later when I scanned, and I just wanted to have everything on one sheet. But like a lot of comic book artists, like they'll cut their page in half or in thirds, and they'll hand it to their assistants if they're working on paper, so they can do it, and then they put it together with tape again and send it to get it scanned or photographed, like back in the day. So like they're not looking at their originals like they're valuable or they're even like something nice to look at. Like, and I understand that because I have very few good originals from comics that like I could just like display or frame and like they look cool because they're clean and they're nice. A lot of my stuff is just, it's just horrible. Like I think it's horrible, and it was done in a hurry. It was done in desperation caused by a deadline that was lethal. And I just did whatever I had to. I used ballpoint pen, pencil, whatever. And I think, obviously, right, when you make this, you're thinking, I hate this. I don't want to look at it again. There's other people who might really appreciate that process, and I understand that. But I think that's also the reason why these artists throw that out. They don't want people looking at it and be like, oh, this is how he did this? This is gross. The comic looks so much better. So, like, that's one reason to throw the stuff out. Another thing I heard is that most creators, when you're selling your original work, it's basically a sign that you're retiring, that you're done, that you're over the hill. At least in Japan, like most creators don't, if they hold on to their Genko, they don't sell it. They don't sell it at all. And if they sell it like at the end of their career, and it's part of like their retirement, you know? And I mean, I believe if comic book artists, if we could do that here, if we could hold on to our originals and have our careers and have them all, and then at some point, you know, if we have a great career or whatever, those pages are worth a ton, and they can actually be your retirement rather than like not having a retirement, which is mostly comic book artists in the States. You know, there's no like plan for retirement or anything. But if you sell off all your pages right away, you don't have those, and you haven't given them enough time to appreciate, you know? Like if you sold all your first series work, then you don't have that anymore. And you don't know how far that series could go. Like you create a character, a new character, and I mean, it happens with everything. There's series like, you know, like Guardians of the Galaxy and other stuff that like back when they were you know, people were reading them, they weren't like a top tier thing. And then now there's like giant movies with like figures, like $300 toys and all this stuff. And it's like, if that's something you created or had a part in and you have the original art, it might be something people are like, yo, I need that, how much? And that's why you end up getting people selling their original art for like, you know, 5 figures in 1 page. And you're like, what? And, well, because they held on to it. So comic book artists in Japan hold on to their work or throw it away, I guess. And maybe there's no in between. There's probably in between too. But definitely selling originals as art is not part of the model. But it also happens that way, I believe, because artists own their own properties, and the publisher makes enough money as a publisher, and therefore they pay the artist enough off of publishing alone, so they don't have to mess with media rights and all that stuff. And the artists don't have to find a way for supplemental income, which is what you do here. Here you're thinking, okay, my page rate is this much, and then I can sell the page for another page rate or twice another page rate or whatever you figured out that you can do. And so you factor that into how much you're going to make that year. Comic book artists in Japan don't do that. They don't consider their genko another, like, I don't know, monetary asset or, you know, whatever. Does that make sense?
It does. When I visited Shueisha, the editor-in-chief said that there's the one manga series that ran in Shonen Jump for a long time that hit 200 volumes. It's that little police guy that has the unibrow.
Oh yeah, Kochikame.
That's it. And you just said the abbreviated title because the title's like really that long. It's like a paragraph.
I don't even know the title. I just know Kochikame and that's it. And I haven't read it, but I know exactly what he looks like. I've seen little figurines of him everywhere. Like, he's crazy, super pop. Is that the longest ongoing?
It is. Yeah. And I think it finished at 200 volumes, but he said that the editor-in-chief said that manga and also Kinnikuman, even though I know I'm saying it incorrectly, but Muscle.
Yeah, no, Kinnikuman. Yeah, you got it.
Both of those series, the Genko, there is, like, the original art is held in its own apartment building, like presumably one of those mansions that you mentioned. But you know, 200 volumes times 200 pages. How many fucking pages is that? In a place where, you know, real estate is a premium. They're not making more land out there. So there would be they just have these apartment archives full of the original art. Yeah. And that's it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, again, that's also like comic book history or Japanese comic book history. It's spanned through decades. So I think, like, if you were to read, and most people don't read the 200 volumes, they just start whenever they start and keep going. And then maybe there's compilations of like the great stories. But I feel like when you span decades with your series, you're always doing things that are relevant to what's going on. So I'm pretty sure, even though I haven't read the series, that like the kind of crimes and things that people are doing in the beginning of the series compared to like the 200th volume are going to be different. And I'm wondering if they stayed, again, these are all questions that if I read, I would know, but like if they stayed in a certain period or if it got updated. Like, do the people have cell phones in the 200, like the hundreds volumes, and, you know, they have like a flip phone or pay phone or whatever at the beginning, you know? That's the other thing. Like, some series just stay, you know, if they're fantasy or whatever, they kind of stay encapsulated in a certain time frame. But then other comics, and a lot of the ones that are really popular in Japan, they rely on current events and fads and things that people are doing, and like fashion and politics and whatever, to keep it current and keep it like exciting for like new readers. And that's one thing that definitely got me and like sold me on like that way, that form of storytelling, is that like I could find a handful of things that I could relate to on a personal level just because I'd seen them myself in real life. It's very simple. If you have a setting that like people have been to and they read that comic, they're like, oh, I've been there. Like, it kind of, you pause there. You're drawn into the story. It's like relatable even more so now because you have those things. Or like if some character's wearing a pair of shoes you have, if that ever happens, you're like, yo, okay, like, all right, this isn't just like somebody flying around doing stuff that like I'm never going to see that probably in my lifetime. This is something I can definitely understand. This character might be like me or not like me. You know, to me, I think that's always a good draw. And also, I don't remember what your question was. I just completely went off again.
You think about like the first times I seen like legit fashion wear in American comics, it was probably Jim Mahfood drawing people with Public Enemy shirts or, you know, Beastie Boy shirt or like some Air Force Ones or whatever. And I remember as a little dude thinking like, is that even legal? You know, like is Nike going to come after him or something?
Also, not to cut you off. I was going to say I thought the same thing, right? When I saw like Nikes or Adidas, shell toes or whatever in a comic. And in Japan, companies don't care if you use their logos or whatever. They see it as free advertisement. Now, it's up to the artists whether they want to give free advertisement or not. So a lot of artists just change the logo kind of. They make it like a funny name that sounds like the thing. And I think that's more than anything, like just not wanting to give props to that company or not caring to do it, just wanting to do your own thing. But it's not a legal thing. Like there's no like, actually, I guess it depends. Because I remember once in PEEPO CHOO, I had some billboards that had like the names of some banks and stuff. And then my editor's like, oh, yeah, I think it had like Nakata, who's like a Japanese soccer player from like back in the day. I think he's probably retired already. But he played in the World Cup and he was like really popular in Japan. And it was a billboard that had him on it from like a real, because I used all the locations in PEEPO CHOO are real parts of Tokyo that I went and took photos myself and then drew off of those. And so there's a billboard with his face on it, and my editor was like, no, like we need to change the face or like just take it off and put another image in there. Even though it was like inked, like it wasn't just a photo of him. So some brands, like there's Family Mart is like a 7-Eleven, and in PEEPO CHOO, I call it Mamily Fart. So I just switched the two letters, and then like, you know, people who know English in Japan, and Mamily just sounds like something motherly, because again, it's a different language, but like they kind of got it. They're like, oh, that's stupid. I don't know. A friend of mine saw it and he's like, you're an asshole. But but yeah, I think like the whole copyright thing, it's kind of like Dojinshis. Like there's people who've made a living doing their own fictional, like their fanfic about Evangelion or like whatever it is. And the publishers, they know that exists. They see it and they support it because they see it as free advertisement. You know, somebody who like just likes, you know, dirty comics might find an Evangelion one where they're all having like a, you know, a wild party. And then eventually they might be like, oh, well, what's this original thing? Like this comic was cool, but like, I like these characters. And then, I mean, I think maybe Gainax sees it that way. They're like, no matter how you find out about our characters, whether it's fanfic or something that's like mature adult and like definitely not what we create, if that's how you find out about it and end up buying a figure or like getting the DVD or buying the comics, you know, it's more advertisement for us. So maybe the companies see it that way. Because I thought that was amazing. I think if you started doing fanfic here and selling like gangbusters because you're doing a better job than like the people at the publisher that are doing that comic, like legitimately with the publisher, they would shut you down in 2 seconds. You know, like if you just said, yo, I'm going to do like the dopest Spider-Man story ever that nobody's ever going to do through the original publisher. And then you just started doing that and selling it at at Artist Alley. And all of a sudden you're selling like 200,000 because like nobody would ever be able to see a Spider-Man story like this. They would shut you down. You'd be in court like yesterday, dude. So, but in Japan, no. Some of those things sell like crazy. Like, oh, this is one thing. Last time we were talking about Comic and how like whether editors went there to look for talent or not. And they used to, but they don't anymore because those creators don't need to work for a large publisher like Kodansha or Shueisha. They really don't. They have their audience, which is like huge. They just find out through Comic. So like these people work, like some of these people work three days a year. And that work it entails having a enormous stack of your comics and like helpers to assist you. You know, and they're wearing gloves and they're like, I'm packing shit. And then you sign the books and they go out and you move units. Like you're moving like, you know, like 10,000 books or 20,000 books.
Yeah. Once again, it's worth letting everybody know that at this festival, it is 750,000 people come through, like paying customers come through this festival. So you could move units in a spot like that.
Yeah. So like, and I remember talking to an editor, and he's like, yeah, we went up there. And I guess one editor was kind of like real cocky because he came from a really big publisher, right? So he's like, oh, business card. And then like, well, I'm from here, and we might be willing to give you a shot. And the artist was like, hell no, like, what are you talking about? Give me a shot? Like, please, I don't need you guys. I'm good. Like, I'm good here. Like, it's just very different as a publishing industry, as like the readership is so much more vast, and you just need to find your niche. That's all you need to do, because there are enough people reading. And I mean, I've been thinking recently, I mean, it might be the case here too. You don't need like 1 million people reading your stuff. If you can just find all the people that like your stuff, if you can just let yourself known to them, be like, this is the type of work I make, this is my style, which is more than just like visuals. It's like, this is the content, this is the kind of creator I am, and this is what I like. And again, what I'm saying, you guys already know, obviously, but like, I think a lot of people in comics and a lot of comic book creators don't really consider this, either because they haven't seen something that's kind of like made them think, oh wait, I could do that. And if you can find your audience, especially now with like just social media and people being able to follow and like check in on creators or on whoever, if you can find all the people who like your stuff, you can just do that. You can just do that, and like you can excel at exactly the type of stuff you want to do, rather than like maybe because you need work, like compromising certain things you want to do just to like, because we all need to work. And when you're doing something creative, then it becomes a balance that's kind of hard sometimes between like what you're really dying to do. I think like a lot, I wouldn't want to say most, but maybe many creators struggle with this like all the time. I think like they have a job, it's a great job, it pays well, it's in an industry where they have certain order to at least like the monetary compensation of their life as a creative, but then they're constantly wishing they were doing something else. And in the case of these people in Dojinshi, they're doing exactly what they want, and they're doing it the way they want, and like they don't have an editor even, because these creators are like, why would I choose to have to find another? I already have my audience. Why would I do this and have somebody give me their opinion on what I can and cannot do, and then do that, and then risk also it not doing what I'm already doing now that works for me? So it's really interesting. I don't know.
It seems like one of the popular models of the comic scene now. It's the closest comparison that we have would be like the successful Image books are from people who were doing Marvel DC work for a period of time, built their audience there, and then, save all their good ideas for their own, creator own shit. So like the model for successful Dojinshi people, at least lately, is you do some assist work with a big mangaka, and sort of that's how you make your initial bones or whatever. Or you're a rookie and you do one shots for a little while, get a little name in Shonen Jump or something, and then just immediately launch into your Dojinshi. And those people are acclimated to you a little bit. They know your name. That does a little bit of the heavy lifting. And then when you're at Comiket, you do gangbusters. But like they said that like the dominant Dojinshi there now, it's that boys love subgenre. But then there's another festival, because like, we hear about Dojinshi and we hear that it's like the promise of amazing fan fiction of Ninja Turtles. But then when you go to floor number 5 in Akihabara Mandarake, and you go to the Turtles section, it's all like orgies of the Turtles, So it's like I thought that we were just going to get like a really cool story, like like a spy story or some shit. But there's another festival called Comitia or something like that.
Yeah, that's what it's called.
And that is the one that has that kind of Dojinshi, where it's like people like there's not like a sexual component. It's just like they're doing their best version of like a Metal Gear Solid,
right.
you know, comic book. So have you been to either of those festivals or both of them to check them out?
I've been to neither, unfortunately. And the other thing is, like, I did a comic about it once, like a little short, like color comic. Like I was hired by like a Japanese tourism company to go on a tour and, you know, kind of observe what's going on. I mean, it was awesome because I went on a tour, observed everything, took notes, and then I just did like a mini comic about it in color, and like that was it. But that was the first time I got to like really see other parts of Japan that weren't Tokyo. You know, like my boss at the karaoke, who was there with us, that was like my family in Japan. Once in a while, he'd take me like camping. We'd do something like that. Actually, the morning editorial at Kodansha also like would take me out every once in a while. I think they felt bad because they're like, this guy is living like completely a different country, and he's just working like a maniac and not really seeing anything else. I think they probably wanted to show me cool stuff to like, so I wouldn't go crazy. But I hadn't seen much of Japan, so I didn't get to go to those conventions or anything. Like I was just stuck working. Like if you want to go to Japan and publish, like you're not gonna see much of anything if you're getting published. If you're going there and like trying to get published, then at least you don't have like crazy deadlines, so you could probably see more. But I didn't get to see much of Japan for the first 2 years I was there. I saw a lot of Tokyo, and then every once in a while, like maybe I would go to like, you know, like some trip with like my editor would take me on a trip or something, which was cool. But I never got to see these conventions. I've talked about them extensively with different artists who tell me like, yo, it's the way it's the way to go. And it also depends on what you want to do, you know. And that's a different way of approaching like becoming successful at your trade. Like some people have a very traditional way of seeing it, where it's like you do a weekly, and then the weekly is the big leagues, and it still is in Japan. It's like the reason why people do it is because they want to get known and they want to get huge and they want to get like respect as a creator. And like if you do a weekly, you'll get that. It's if you survive it too, because you know, as you guys said, like they'll vote you down, you know, like those cards that they write in and they say I like this or I don't like that. So I mean, I met a guy who worked for Shonen Jump, and he did a basketball comic, and he only got one tankobon, and they canceled his series. And he was like, at least I got the tankobon. Like he was pumped. And this is a Shonen Jump series. Like it's like that's what the most readers read in terms of like young comics. Like tons of adults read them, and then kids read them. So like for comics, for Shonen, Shueisha, it still to this day, I believe, is the largest, right? When you go to like Seinen for like adults and stuff, then Kodansha starts taking over. And then you got Shogakukan and a couple different ones that have like hits too. But so for him, you know, obviously it's like he had pride that like he did that, you know, he was able to get in and do that. But also he was like, I'm just holding on, like I don't know, like they're gonna cancel my stuff. And people, yeah, and like it was a group of artists, other artists that had worked at Shueisha or did. And people worked at Shogakukan and Kodansha, but we're all there drinking, and they were giving opinions. They're like, of course, this is after they're all loosened up and they all know each other, so they can joke around. And dude's like, I don't know, man. Like, I think they're gonna cancel me. And they're like, yeah, no, they're canceling your shit, dude. Like, that's something nobody. Again, you could only say that to somebody you really trust, who's a friend, and you know is not gonna get angry, or is not gonna like get trigger shy when they got a draw because you told them something like this, you know, and like now they're like, I can't do it, you know. So it was like eye-opening for me to see that kind of like communication, but also it's stressful as hell because this guy meant it. He was just like, I don't know. That's another question you hear a lot, like when you're hanging out with groups of artists, is they all say, I don't know what I'm going to be doing 5 years from now. And like a lot of times these are creators that are, and I don't want to say who they are just because I feel like these are just conversations we had in private. And so like, you know, but they have huge series that people in the States know about. So, but that are also big in Japan. Like there's series that are like huge here and didn't have such a massive effect in Japan. That's another one of the themes of PEEPO, is Is that like there's things that blow up somewhere and like you don't really know why, or there is a specific reason why these things are doing well in a certain part of the world? But these are creators that are big in Japan, and they're known here, and they've had like live action adaptations and animated adaptations of their work. So like they're like established. We would think, all right, like you're good. Like you're making not only royalties off of your books, but also off of like animation and toys and all this stuff. And they were saying like, I don't know where I'm gonna be 5 years from now, and I'm concerned. And like, I think that was honest. I don't think it was just you just saying it just to say it. Like I think it was a genuine thing where like they were like, I enjoy what I'm doing right now, and I'm going as hard as I can right now because I don't know where I'm gonna be in 5 years. And the readership is pretty. I guess the audience in Japan can be pretty fickle when it comes to anything, not just comic books. So like they want new stuff all the time, and they're very used to like a rapid turnover. So like their comedians will be like scorching hot like during a certain amount of time, where they'll be on like trains and buses, like there'll be photos of them. They'll have a commercial for like some big product where they do something stupid, and there's little toys, like little bobbleheads doing the stupid thing they did. And like, it's just huge, where you're like, this is like the hugest person ever. And then like, they'll just be gone in like 2 years. And it's hard for them to get back on because now they like overexhausted their exposure and people have had enough. So they have to like reinvent themselves. And that can happen to a comic book artist too. You know, like it, you know, some comic creators have like their shtick or whatever, and it goes. Somehow they find a way to prolong it, like to keep going, and they're doing something new enough to get people to keep going. And then other creators, they just do like a mega hit, and then like their next thing is just doesn't go anywhere, and then they just kind of like disappear. And they're doing stuff like in like alternative publications even. Like there's some creators from like the 90s that were like really big and kind of like really influential for me. And again, just I don't want somebody to find out about this and be offended somehow or whatever. So I'll just say really influential, huge in the 90s. And now they're publishing through like non-manga publications, because there's magazines that also have manga in them, which I always thought was cool, because it's like, all right, if you have a magazine about like gambling or fashion or politics or cars or whatever, it'll usually have a comic in there that's serialized like every month anyway, and you can buy the tankobon, but it's a smaller publisher. They don't do comics, but it might end up being a comic that's just for you. Like it's the coolest shit ever. Like there was one that I liked a lot that was published through a fashion magazine, and like it, if you read the fashion magazine, that's the comic you read. Like you bought that one all the time. So that creator found his niche market. And I mean, that fashion magazine could sell as much as like a comic magazine, but it's just a different audience. But then because it's Japan, a ton of those people that read about fashion, they like comics too, because they've never stopped reading comics at a certain age, or never not picked up comics. Like everybody picks up comics. So like you learn how to read with like Anpanman and stuff like that, you know? So like, and then you got like crazy stuff that pertains to like your career or your studies or your hobbies. So like you just never really stop. Most people don't. So if you're reading this fashion magazine, tons of people that are into fashion, this is the comic for them. They might not like One Punch Man. They might not like Kochikame, but like this one's about like dope shoes or like hoodies and jackets, or like, you know, and they'll go into it. They'll talk about like stitching and kinds of like fasteners and buttons and zippers and whatever. Like they get real technical, and it'll be like the most hardcore comic about fashion, and it ends up doing just fine. That creator doesn't need to go anywhere else to do stuff, but it's because there's a culture of reading these comics, and there's also a culture of creating comics that are different and that might go against the norm. That's another thing I noticed. Editorial, it's like you pitch something to them and they're like, all right, like how can you make that even crazier? How can you like distill it even more so it's like just that one flavor, you know? And sometimes amazing stuff comes out of it that like people would never think of, and that I think we definitely here could never foresee certain things being huge. you know, just because it's like, well, who wants to read that? And it's like, oh, all of a sudden tons of people do, you know? So I don't know.
That's been a big change in American comics in the past bunch of years is like cartoonists finding little holes in the American in finding their own kind of niche in the American comic book market and just filling in that gap and to great rewards.
Yeah.
Felipe, can we talk a bit about what happens after you wrap up PEEPO CHOO?
The pitch process, the pitch process for the next 2 years. You were out there 4 years, 2 years on PEEPO CHOO, 2 years pitching. So let's get into that latter part.
Oh, what happened after PEEPO CHOO?
Yeah.
Yeah. So after PEEPO CHOO, I was like, I was having health problems because of just sitting for like a year and a half and not moving around and not really getting any sun at all because I was indoors. I was like in a rough shape and I was really stressed out. And it wasn't so much, the pace of doing comics was the least, after a while it became the least stressful of the thing. I guess the least stressful thing was drawing pages in a hurry at a certain point. And normally that would be stressful, but there were other things that were like stressing me out even more. Just living there as a foreigner who understands the language, I thought would be an advantage. And the longer I stayed there, I learned that it might be in a lot of ways a disadvantage to know the language fluently, because you've got an information overload. You're finding out things that like might be a bummer, and people are unfiltered around people they assume can't understand. So like I was hearing tons of stuff about me, about like whatever all the time and whenever I was out, because people just assumed I didn't understand. And so I was getting a side of Japan that most people will never get. And so like, I think when I came back from Japan, I was like, you know, I didn't even want to talk about Japan anymore. I was like, no. And people were like, why did you come back? Like that place is the best place in the world. Like, oh, you hit the lottery and then you just like threw away all the money. And it's like, no, like people did. That's something that unless you have that experience and you're able to like talk firsthand to people and also like read signs and just people's attitudes and what they're talking about and stuff, you're not going to get a full picture of that. And you're going to have a different experience. So like for me, by the time I finished PEEPO CHOO, like I had a pretty good understanding of like the country's culture and like deeper aspects of like society in Japan, rather than just like a pop culture kind of like idea of what the country is that you could get from going there and not being able to communicate with people and just taking everything in through your eyes and that's it, you know? And so, and the other thing is I did I'm glad, basically my editor told me, cause I did 3 volumes, right?
Right.
And 3 volumes is a short series. And usually when you're doing a series, unless you decided upon 3 numbers, most series want to go on as long as they can, as long as it makes sense for them to go on and they're entertaining and they're selling well. It's the business model is that if this works, people want it, let's keep giving them what they want. If we're starting to see that people don't want it and we have time to wrap it up in a good way, we'll do that. Some series just get like canceled, like this guy that was doing the basketball thing in Shueisha. And they don't get to like finish it up nicely. I was lucky that it was doing well enough that they could give me a heads up, a volume in advance saying we might have to start wrapping this up, right? Other creators in my magazine just got canceled. So for a Westerner that's like a rookie and all that, like I didn't do that bad. But for me, I was looking at series that were like, 10, 20, 30 volumes. I was like, that is what a series that does well does. It keeps going. So for me, I was like, I'm fucking up. Like I need to keep going. Like this is 3 volumes is bullshit. My editor told me like when we ended the series, and which I got to end it with like the messages I wanted and everything. It wasn't abrupt, but he told me, we want to keep working with you. We want to get into your next series. Like we think you have the opportunity of making a hit. Like we just need to, maybe it's not PEEPO CHOO, like you got it in you, let's do it. So let's do another one. And I was like, cool, let's do it. I was super exhausted. The other thing my editor did, which was cool, because you know he'd be a pretty serious dude and kind of like not say much. Other times, like he knows when to. A good editor in Japan is like your cheerleader and like the person that like gives you the incentive you need when like you're at the end of your rope. That comes through story, through art too. Sometimes they're like, yo, like this expression is looking really busted. Like you got to do this again. Like you're not putting through enough of the emotion that's called for in this scene. Like they're very particular about that. They're really careful and meticulous about it. And it's great because when you're working and at the speed you have to work with like little sleep and maybe other stuff that's going on in your regular life, because I mean, I'm assuming as a Westerner, I had shit that was going on for me that was different. But as a Japanese artist, you could be going through whatever, a divorce or whatever it is that you're going through. You still have to do this comic. You can't stop this. You can't call your editor and say, yo, my wife just took my kid. And so like, I can't deal with this right now. Like I'm getting sued. Like, no, on top of all that, you got to do this thing on time. Like, I think people don't realize that either. Like this is, you know, so when you're going through all that, your editor like comes to bat for you and like hooks it up. Like he's like, all right, cool. Don't worry about this stuff. I'm going to think about this. I'm going to think about the scene. I'm going to think about what these characters would do. And I'll hit you up with some ideas. Fucking draw your pages because we got like, you know, we got like 28 hours and counting. And so you do that. And without that guy, like that thing wouldn't have gotten done in 28 hours. But then he comes back to you with some notes. He's like, yo, what if like your character says this? Does that make sense? Because then this could happen. And then you're like, okay, that is amazing. Or you're like, no, but actually, if he said this instead, then we could still have that ending. And then the editor's like, all right, that works. Let's go. Let's do it. So it's like pretty intense. I went through that. Then I finished. Then my editor told me, listen, like, you're seeing this wrong. Like, you're looking at PEEPO as like, I feel like you're looking at this as not a great success because you ended in 3 volumes. And he's like, you have to realize some of your peers didn't even get 1. And you're not from here. And this is another thing he never did. I told him when I started, like, I don't want you to look at me as a foreign creator. I mean, as much as you're gonna have to, because just look at me. But like, I don't want you to treat me differently. I want to do things the way everybody else does them here. You know, so like whatever it takes, like I'm down, you know. And he really respected that. But then he just took that to heart and to task, dude. He gave me a ass beating, like just ruthless, merciless. But I mean, it's what I wanted. I wanted to learn. I wanted to do things the right way and see what it was. So by the end of that series, when he told me, you've done a great thing. And yes, we want to do more. And we want you to have a huge hit. But this is really good. And you should be proud of what you've done, right? Because I was pretty down. So he said, after all this shit, right, 1.5 years of just nonstop, I had about 3 days off a month for 1.5 years. So I was like not in the best shape, like health-wise. And like my mind was like, you know, I was having a hard time. And he's like, all right, so yeah, you know, take a break. Get a little vacation time, you know, freshen up, get your ideas flowing. And then we'll come back and like we'll start working on a new pitch. So, and I'm like, all right, that sounds great. Like I need a break. And they're like, all right, no, you deserve one. You deserve one. You've done a great job. So, all right, so what do you think? In 2 weeks? 2 weeks, bring us a pitch. That, I'm serious. To them, that was like a break a break, dude. I'm not lying. I'm not exaggerating. It's 100% the truth. They told me straight up, all right, so 2 weeks, you know, like you'll be rested. And I paused and I was like, and I laughed. I laughed because I didn't want to cry. I'm like, no, 2 weeks? Can I get a little bit more? Like 2 weeks is like, I need a little bit more. And they're like, okay, all right, what do you want? Like, you know, I'm like, can I do like maybe like 4 weeks, like a full month? And they're like, okay, all right. Like they weren't even feeling that, dude. They're like, we need to do this shit. You need to get on that, dude. Like they were babying me by letting me take 4 weeks off after 1.5 years of like almost nonstop work. So that's why when I came back, people were like, where'd you come back? I'm like, dude, because I can't live like this, yo. I love comics. That's like the dopest shit to me is telling stories with pictures and text and having like a very kind of intimate bond with a single reader. Like people don't read comics in groups. So that's a one-on-one with the reader. It's you and the reader. And like you can choose to like show them whatever you want and tell them whatever you want. And to me, that's like crazy special. Like that's like that's the medium for me. Is like, if I can draw and tell you something, you know. But as much as I love it, after doing that, like I needed it at least a month. And I thought a month was short, but like that's what I was gonna get before they were just like, all right, dude, do you want to do this or not? So I took my month and then I started pitching. I pitched 5 different series, like character designs, character descriptions, and plot, like summary, you know, and yeah, and it was rough. It was rough because I would bring it in. And the other thing is, I saved all these things. I brought them back. Like when I came back to the US, I shipped all my clothes and everything. The only thing I brought with me were my hard drives, my computer, and then just all the originals from PEEPO CHOO and all the pitches I did. I couldn't lose that. Like, and I still have it, and it's stored. Like, I pitched 5 things. Out of those 5 things I pitched, 4 of them would be great for a Western audience. Like that I understand. So I'm like, yo, this is really good. I mean, you say it about your own work, you're an asshole. But like, I was like, this will have an impact. And what I base my opinion on is that if I don't see it out there, and it has enough elements that really entertain people in different genres, it'll probably work because it has the hooks already. It just has content that's different. So if you can hook people in and then they read it and they're like, whoa, what? To me, that's a win. That's a solid win. And so like, I try to do that. So when I did these, I'm like, yo, like you guys are definitely not doing this. But they're like, oh, it became this thing about, which I completely understand. It became this thing about, well, the Japanese reader likes this. And that's where I feel like it's a bit of a, it's not a handicap. It's just an extra, like, it's an extra hurdle because as a Westerner, I have like I think I have kind of like an understanding of people's perceptions on certain issues and certain themes and certain art styles. And I can play with that and be like, okay, well, people are going to think this is really cute. So I make something really cute and then it becomes very gross. So people are going to react from this and they're not going to be expecting it. In a different culture, that's going to change. So a lot of what I was pitching, they were saying, well, but this character should be more like this because that way we'll understand them as Japanese readers. So then I'm like, okay, but now I don't have the security of understanding this character that well. It's no longer like my character. It's a character that I have to defer to my editor a lot to figure out what this character's motivation is sometimes. So then I realized I had to just go fantasy. Because if I did that, then at least I didn't have to like be beholden to Japanese societal rules to make this character work. And then fantasy, you got to build a whole world, and they're like, we're not into that. And then it turned into a thing where they were like, well, we want you to, what they really wanted me to do was do something autobiographical. They're like, you can pitch some other stuff, but like, we really just want you to do like an essay manga where it's like it's not done in like, it's sometimes it's more text and it's a couple illustrations. Sometimes it's like prose with illustrations. Sometimes it's more like a comic book, but there's different styles of doing it. But they basically wanted me to tell a story from my perspective about my experience in Japan. And I was too close to the current situation to do that. I couldn't do it because what I realized was it has to be entertaining. And I was just way too stressed out and too deep into all of these things I experienced for the first time that I wasn't going to be able to objectively make it entertaining without it being very aggressive or like sound like it's like complaints or maybe it would even be in some way offensive, you know, just because it's my point of view. And I mean, with that type of thing, I think if I were to be honest about a lot of things I wanted to say at the time, it might have come off, you know, wrong or just very aggressive. And that's not something people are going to read. You know, I believed in entertaining people. So if I could tell all the things I went through in a funny manner that was like self-deprecating and not pointing any fingers at anybody, then it would have been like, all right, this is entertaining, this is great. And now we have like insight into how a Westerner who's come into our culture and understands what we're doing and how we're seeing things and the way we do things and why, if it's done humorously, even if I'm doing stuff that might be a little bit like like I'm judging them or whatever. If I can do it funny, then at least it's not bad. There's no way I could have done that at the time. I was just way too stressed out and upset about stuff, and like just drained of energy. Like I was drained of courage. Like, so pitching these things just became this thing where it was harder and harder to pitch. And eventually I pitched a series that had all of these feelings I had of like just being very upset. It's like I became a teenager again or something. I was just like angry about shit, and like, well, no, I wasn't like a teenager, because a teenager still doesn't have enough experience to understand why these things are making them angry, and doesn't have enough experience to understand what can be avoided, right? Because you're just dealing with the fact that like you're not a kid now, and like you're not an adult, and like, but you feel like you know what you're talking about and you know shit, but people still want to like baby you and be like, you don't know shit. All right. So I wasn't at that point. I just understood why I was bummed out, but also understood why the situations were the way they were in Japan culturally. Like I understood why people would say certain things to me that were like completely like fucked up, but I would understand that they didn't have enough reference of other things to not do that. So then I felt like I didn't really have the right to get angry either, because it's not their fault. They just don't know. They've only lived in their own country. It's like if I was Serbian and I came to the States and Americans are like off the hook doing fucked up shit that's like really offensive to me, but I'm in the States. I'm not in Serbia, and they don't know. They don't speak Serbian. They have no idea. So then I got to deal with it. I can either stay here in the States with this American tomfoolery and just deal with it, or I go back to Serbia or go somewhere else. And that was kind of where I was at, where I was like, well, I came to Japan. Nobody asked me to do this. Like I wanted to do the comics here. So pitching during being in that state of mind is hard, especially when they're asking you to do something personal and like, and trying to be really honest and open. And I couldn't do it at the time. So I tried, and when I sat down in front of the paper, I was already auto-editing myself. I was like, if I say that, they're gonna think this or that, so I can't do that. And it got to a point where I called the editor, and this wasn't even for like a manga magazine. This was for it was a magazine. It was like a culture magazine about like foreign news and cultural issues and like technology and like fads in Japan. It was kind of like a different, I don't know. They joked about it. They said, one editor told me, this is the magazine for like Japanese people who want to think they're advanced and highbrow. So it's kind of like that. It had like things about like foreign affairs and like, oh, this fashion is cool in Europe and like whatever. And so like they were like, we want you to write a comic here. And I mean, I think that was probably a good idea, because somebody who read in Japan who read that type of magazine might be the type of person that would be interested in how a foreigner feels about their own culture. Like they might be open enough to want to know, good or bad, what a foreigner feels. But from what I'd seen on TV and the news and like these variety shows where they have talents, is what they call them, but they're like just foreigners who speak Japanese and they have them on, that's not the case. And from my perspective, what the Japanese want to see when they see a foreigner is like someone, either like a character. They want to see someone who's really handsome, or a woman who's really beautiful in a very foreign type of way that's not Japanese, or they want like a complete clown that's just becomes a character and like just throws thumbs up, and like whenever you look at the foreign characters in the early Street Fighter games, and they're all like, yeah, and like just doing weird maraca dances, like DJ, the Jamaican character in Street Fighter Alpha and all that. That comes from them not knowing, but also like just a predisposition to form a character that they find entertaining and that they like. They want to see it that way. So like, I was dealing with that too. Like sometimes, I would have, like I was on TV a few times and talking about like my work and whatever. And a lot of times they would ask me like, hey, like, do you know how to dance? Like, could you dance a little bit for us in this segment? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, why would you ask me to do that? I didn't even say that. What I said was, would you ask another Japanese comic book artist to dance for you? Like, is that something they do for a living, or is it a main reason why you're interviewing them? And then the producer would be like, wow, no, but I mean, you look so cool and you're such a cool guy. And like, we imagine by the way you look, that you could probably dance really well. So like, you know, we were just thinking, and I'm like, nah, you know, I can dance, but like, I don't think it pertains to this segment. So I'm not gonna do that. And that would upset some of these, but I was like, I felt a responsibility to go against that. Like when I rode the train and saw ads, there'd be a white guy, and of course he has a cowboy hat on. Like it was very, you know, if it was like a black dude, he always had like a basketball under his arm, and he was like doing, you know, hand gestures, and it was just very like kind of, it was very evident that like this was something they were into. They like in a way keeping foreigners eternally foreign, in terms of like them being depicted in a way that like they're different, they look different, they can't speak your language, they don't understand your customs because your Japanese customs are so weird, and like, and so they find that funny and they want to perpetuate that kind of image. Well, when I got that, I'm like, no, I learned Japanese to not do that, and I'm not gonna put on a cowboy hat or do nonsense. And I remember like I had a meeting with one. This all has to do with my pitching time. Like those last 2 years while I was pitching, I was doing these other things because, you know, like some of these things paid, and like I didn't want to be a talent. I didn't want to just be someone on TV just because like I'm not Asian and I speak Japanese. I just some people make a career out of that, but also I feel like they perpetuate a stereotype of foreigners that doesn't help us at all when we go there. Didn't help me. Like I was just, you know, like they would compare me to like some of these people, and like it was just like, yo, no, I came here to do something specific, which is to tell stories and draw and write, you know, not to like be like this weird kind of puppet that serves. But some fighters, there's like fighters in Japan who've gone there and, you know, they've had a bit of a fighting career, and then they realize that like doing commercials where they play patty cake and spin around and dance and do weird stuff, you know, pays off. And so they just do that. But what happens is a Japanese person that sees, all they see of foreigners is that, and then our movies, which are like full of violence and crazy shit and whatever, that's their perspective. So when they meet someone that looks like me that shows up, they expect me to be like a maniac. Like my editor thought I owned a gun, I had a bunch of tattoos, and all these other things that we just assumed them. And I'm like, no, man, I don't own a gun. I have no tattoos at all. And like, I'm probably pretty normal. If you ask me a set of questions that you think are the most American stuff, I probably don't fit in most of those, you know? And so I'd have a meeting. I remember a producer told me, when we had a meeting, and it was going to be, they shot like 3 days of my everyday life, like me cooking, grocery shopping, drawing my pages and whatever. And so, you know, we met, and then I just spoke to him, and then he's just like, "Yeah, Felipe は日本語喋れるのはものすごく助かったから、もう本当に嬉しいね。言ってることが通じると、これは簡単になるからありがとう." He's like, "Yo, the fact that you speak Japanese makes it so much easier. The fact that like we can communicate so easily makes this like a walk in the park. Like I'm so happy about that." So then we talked about like what kind of things I wanted to talk about in the documentary, which things I wasn't interested in, how I felt about Japan and the series and whatever. And I was pretty frank with him, you know, like I told him I've never been an otaku. Like I've never been like a super fan of like anime or manga in general, but as a medium, I thought like this is for me. I can write and I can draw and like I want to do this, but I've never been like a super fan of like tons of things. I never cosplayed or did anything like that. And that's an image, like mangaka, they have an image of that over there where you're kind of like a nerd and a geek and whatever. Also, not everybody, but that's also like, can be one of the stereotypes, right? That's why they kept telling me, like, you know, I didn't look like a comic book artist. You know, you look like, and they did. I'm wearing a soccer jersey today. It's the Argentine national jersey. But like, yeah, people are like, you look like a soccer player. You don't look like a comic book artist. But when, you know, after we talked and everything, he said, まあ、いや、日本語喋るの助かったんだけど、撮影の時は英語で話してください。And he said, like, you know, this is great that we could speak all in Japanese, but when we shoot, we want you to speak in English. And I'm like, well, why? Like, I'm like, no. And I just told him, I speak Japanese. Like, you know, why do you need it in English? Like, you know, just let's just do it in Japanese so people can just hear me saying things just myself in their language. And he's like, yeah, でもなんかちょっとうさんくさい、なんかちょっとおかしい。外国人がこんなペラペラだったら、ちょっとおかしい。外国人っぽくなくなるから英語話してください。I'm doing this in Japanese too for like some Japanese people might listen to this, they'll get like a perspective. And then so basically what he said was, well, the fact that you speak Japanese makes you less foreign looking, you know, and it seems weird. Like you don't seem like a real foreigner if you speak our language. So we'd rather you just spoke in English because then it feels like fresh, like you're really from the outside world. And then I told him, like, you know, if there's anything I say in Japanese that you don't understand, please put subtitles on it. I'm not going to speak in English. He hated that. But I was like, no, dude, fuck it. Like, I'm not going to help perpetuate this bullshit. We can learn your language. It's not that hard. It's not, you guys aren't that different. Like, you do have cultural differences. But, like, perpetuating this stuff doesn't, I don't like it. I don't like it. Like, it was just a personal thing. They never put subtitles on that, like, half an hour thing. Like, they didn't have to. But I just didn't want to be like there's a fighter, the K1 fighter named Bob Sapp. He used to be a football player, and then I don't know what else he did. And he went into fighting.
Giant dude.
Enormous. He's enormous. And he didn't do that well in K1 because fighting wasn't like his, I mean, he was an athlete that went into that because he was huge. But, you know, like smaller guys would like just get him right and he'd go down. But then he went into comedy. But he would do weird, you know, he'd wear a diaper and go out there and be like, ugh. It's just like, yo, it's fine because they would pay. I was on a segment for 15 minutes once for like another show and they paid me $1,000. So like, that's crazy. Like that's 15 minutes, that's nothing. Like, you know, so some people are like, okay, I'll show up, I'll do whatever. Like this is some serious money. I don't care. But for me, I just think that affects the overall national idea of like someone that looks like Bob Sapp. Oh, he's big and funny. And so now you see someone that's like Bob Sapp who might be like a super serious guy that's like would like to be respected for being like a nuclear physicist or whatever. But people are going to see him and be like, and do that shit. And it's just like, we don't need that anymore, man. That needs to stop. So like I tried to do my part. It's the same thing about whenever I met a Japanese person. Whenever I met someone in person, I was always I would try to be like exceptional because I felt like I was a representative of Americans in Japan. So whenever someone talked to me, a lot of times I was the first Westerner they ever spoke to in Japanese. They would always tell me that. That's why I would always have to explain to people why I spoke Japanese. And telling them, hey, you can learn a language you can learn is not enough. You have to say, yeah, I needed it because I wanted to do comics. And so like I realized like I wasn't going to get a chance to do what I wanted in my own country. So I had to learn your language because you have a broader, you know, industry and whatever. And then I would be told, you use chopsticks so well. That never stopped. For every time I went to eat outside, mind you, I lived there 4 years. Every time I went outside, and I ate with chopsticks, somebody would say, well, hashi jozu desu ne. Like, oh, you're using your chopsticks really well. And like, if you're there for like 3 weeks or whatever, you know, it's amazing. Like you have an in for conversation. You're like, oh yeah, you know, I learned in the States and whatever. But after 4 years of always hearing that, it starts grinding at you. It's something small. It's something small. It's a compliment too. They're like, oh, you know, because a lot of Westerners use forks. They don't, you know. But after you hear that like hundreds of times, it starts, or maybe maybe I don't have enough patience to hear something like 150, 200 times and not crack at some point. But like I realized living there as a foreigner that like, yeah, there's just certain things that you're just never gonna do away with. Like it's never gonna stop. It's you know. But I also wanted to be, you know, I wanted to speak as correctly as possible, as well as possible. The fact that I look the way I do is kind of jarring to them when they're like, wow, but like you know, like, you know, so much and like you're easy to understand. Like you don't have a horrible accent. Like I wasn't conforming to what they see normally in movies or TV shows when a foreigner shows up and he's like, konnichiwa, watashi no namae wa John desu. And they're just like this ridiculous cartoon character. you know, and then I'd show up and just talk like a person, like, and then they're like, wait, well, why is, and yeah, they should, I think it would benefit more. The whole situation would be better if they just realized that, yeah, you know, people can learn this language. On the other hand, if they just expected everybody to be able to learn Japanese really easily, then that would also be horrible, because it's not the easiest language to learn. So in a way, everything I've said right now, it's probably just fine the way it is, because they're very nice to people who like are at a loss for a way to communicate or understand what's going on. So, and this is the reason why I got angry, but felt I didn't have the right to get angry, because I understood why the things were the way they were. If you go there without speaking, people will point things out to you. They'll go with you to a place. They're very kind. They're very helpful to somebody who's obviously in need of help because they can't read and they don't know where they are. And people generally are very nice. I think other countries I've been at, maybe not so many people are that nice to a foreigner who doesn't know stuff. They don't have time for that. They might keep walking, you know. But over there, people in general are very nice. It's that spot you get into where you start realizing and understanding and being able to communicate and see deeper into how things are socially, that it becomes somewhat of a hindrance sometimes. And that I learned. So yeah, that's why I think most of what I say pertains to my personal experience and my set of circumstances. That's why now I've learned to tell people who ask me about Japan something that works. I tell them, you'll probably think Tokyo is your favorite city you've ever gone to in your life, and you'll probably want to live in Japan for sure if you like it that much. I'm sure about that. But living there is different than visiting. And if you're seen as a tourist, it's all fun and games, and you know, like, let's have beer and let's ask them where they came from and whatever. But if you live there and understand what's going on and you can do things for yourself, then it's a little bit different. Then it's not as welcoming. It's more like, what is this person doing here? Why do they know so much? So, and most people don't ever get to have that perspective. So it's interesting. It's a really interesting place. It's very extreme. So going back to what you asked, Ed, the last 2 years pitching my stuff, I pitched a bunch of stuff while like maybe seeing more of the country and doing other things that kind of didn't inform my work for the first time. I was trying to do something that was very separate from what I was feeling. And eventually I came up with a character that I could like put all these frustrations through. And that was the first thing they looked at and they said, this is great. They're like, this could be a hit. Like, let's get going. And the more I worked on it, I started doing Nemu. I did Nemu, like I've got probably over like about at least 200 pages of Nemu that just didn't get used. And like, I could really just do Genko off of, like, do the final and like print it as like a short story and it'd be fine. I'm just holding on to it. But the series they accepted, I kept pitching and I kept like doing more and more Nemu. Because some editors want you to basically draw like the whole first issue. Sometimes they're like, hey, and they kept telling me, do your Nemu fast. Just do them fast, do them fast, do them fast. Just get used to, get into the habit of drawing your Nemu really fast, as if like a state of stream of consciousness. Just sit down and do it. Just go it. Don't edit yourself. Just do it. Like if you have to do 80 pages straight, do those 80 pages straight, and then we'll whittle it down to like the best 20. They're like, if you do 80, those 20 that we whittle it down to are going to be the hottest shit ever. They're going to be so solid and polished, right? So if you have the energy and like, you know, like the fire to do that, you can do that. But sustaining that fire is what's complicated when you're publishing over there. And starting out, like where I was at, my fire was like minimal at that point. I was like having a really hard time. So like the more times I turned in like 60 pages of thumbnails and they look through it and they're like, you know, do another one, like make it more, you know, like more interesting. And then it was just like, and then I realized that the series that they did actually accept, and they're like, okay, let's go, was actually more apt for a Western audience than a Japanese one for many reasons. And that turned out to be something I did a Kickstarter 4 years later, which was Death Metal Zombie Cop. That had actually gotten accepted and they were ready to do it. But what I thought about I thought about it, and it was about police. It was about the law and justice. And the way people see the police in Japan is very different from most Western countries, and especially different from the States. You know, people trust the authorities, and also the authorities are not a very violent, aggressive, they don't have like a violent, aggressive demeanor. They're very kind of like, just from their appearance, first of all, you know, they wear white gloves and they got like this little white like sash over the thing and a little hat, and like they're very polite, and they're not very threatening either. Like they're not, you know, they're not walking around, you know, looking like they're gonna beat somebody down. You know, there's no shootings and stuff, and you know that doesn't go down. Like they apprehend people and they have other techniques. And there's like a little police box. They're called koban. The little police boxes in every neighborhood. Like every couple of blocks there's one, and that's like your neighborhood patrol guy. And so like people will go up to them ask for directions or like whatever. Like it's people's relationship with police is very different in Japan. And obviously it depends on the person, the same as here in the States or any other country. But for the most part, there isn't this like fuck the police attitude in Japan. There just isn't. So already that's taken a little bit out of like what the story could be, right? It could have way more impact if it was made for a Western audience that understands the history of the police and like how, you know, the police act differently depending on like what community they're in or what area or whatever. These are all themes that I couldn't explore doing them in Japan, because for the most part, you know, cops are just like, you know, they ask you to look at your license for your bicycle plate, like your license plate for your bicycle, or, you know, if you're a foreigner, they ask you for your ID to see if you're here legally or whatever, which I never had a problem showing them. And they always ended up asking me why I spoke Japanese so well and all this other stuff. But like, that would be different. The other thing I realized is aesthetically, there's certain things that are considered cool here and cool there. Let's go for like your archetype, your like main guy, like your main protagonist in the comic book. Most comic books here in the mainstream have a muscle-bound person who's like athletic and strong and really tough, right? Basically comic books, let's say that, right? But in Japan, like a really cool guy character could be like really kind of thin and wafy and kind of like androgynous and be like a super badass and be considered really cool. And then a muscular guy might be considered kind of like oafish and not very smart, you know, which is kind of the opposite of what we're portraying here with like these like muscle-bound characters. That's like a cultural thing. So in devising this story, I realized that a lot of the archetypes I understand in Western comic books would lend themselves very powerfully to the story I want to tell if I just did it for a Western audience, instead of trying to adapt these things to a Japanese audience and say, okay, well, this guy, I should make him different because Japanese people will relate to him more like this. But now the fact that he's a cop doesn't matter because he doesn't look a certain way. So the more I thought about it, the more I realized this is going to make way more sense. Horror, the subject of horror and slasher films, completely different in Japan. Horror is ghosts and spirits and like small pale children that crawl on your ceiling and women with black long hair over their face and white gowns crawling out of wells and TV screens. It's weird. It's this weird, like, it's culturally different. It comes from like Shinto religion and whatever. Where our slasher films is like corn-fed mutant wears a mask and like destroys you to bits because you're a teenager having premarital sex and that's bad. Like, we have our own devices, or maniac that goes crazy and starts kidnapping people and putting them through these puzzles that they have to either get out through or not. And then their shortcomings as a person will either decide whether they live or not. Like monsters, somebody crawled out of the sewer and he's fucking people up. Like, we understand all those things. They're normal. So within that context, you can do something new, but with a setting, a premise that people understand. Whereas in Japan, these things aren't understood readily. All these things that I know and I enjoy and I like, and I know how I can kind of subvert them or do stuff with it that might be interesting. In Japan, I can't, because they don't know about Jason. And if they do, it's like they like American shit, and it's kind of this thing. They know about Jason, Freddy Krueger, Chucky, and all that stuff. Like, people here know about Ultraman, Godzilla, and some other stuff. Most people will know about Godzilla. They might not know about like Ultraman, Godaida, Kamen Daida, all these things. That's for people who are into that genre. But for me, I was trying to do like a more readily available thing that most people are going to get. And so that's what Death Metal Zombie Cop became, where I was like, you know what, I should probably, this probably serves better as something geared for Westerners. It doesn't mean people in Japan won't like it. I know it has plenty of elements that they'll enjoy, but I think in terms of like a vision for it, the Western audience allows me to like come at it, you know, with more of my strength, you know, it's just storytelling wise and visually. So yeah, and I mean that I did that Kickstarter, and I've just been wrestling with a lot of stuff to get everybody, to get the books mailed to everybody and the art book. I don't know. I need to do an update on that Kickstarter. People hate me right now, but I've moved 8 years, or not 8 years. I've moved 8 times in the last year and a half, like from apartments. I was in San Francisco. I moved to LA. Like a friend of mine got renal failure. She's also an artist, and she's a really close friend of mine. And she was given a few days. So she called me, and I just went to San Francisco. I just moved to San Francisco. I said, like, I'll be around to help and do whatever I can. And, you know, I'll help take care of you. Whatever I need to do. And, you know, she couldn't move. She couldn't walk. She couldn't watch TV. Like, she couldn't do anything. Like, kidney failure is like super hardcore. Like, your organs, we take them for granted. And like when one of them stops working, it wreaks havoc on like your motor skills, like your brain, like everything. Like, I had no idea about any of this. And so I ended up staying and learning how to, and training for home hemodialysis. And I became a trained dialysis technician. So I would hook her up, and that dialysis basically cleans your blood through a machine, filters your blood, takes the toxins out. That your kidneys usually clear the toxins from your body, that toxins from eating and drinking and whatever. And when your kidneys stop working, you can't do that. So your body becomes very toxic, and you just start shutting down. And so like, if you don't dialyze, you can just fall asleep and just RIP. So that was really serious for me. And like, unfortunately, like all these people in the Kickstarter supported me for this project, which I owe them. And, you know, like I know you did too, Jim, and I appreciate it. It's just that this thing was just like, I had to do this, you know, like your friends, you want to keep them around for as long as you can. And it was a thing where like, I didn't have a full-time job, so I could leave LA and go to San Francisco and help. Like, I felt like that was a sign that like, I wasn't working at Marvel, I wasn't working at Nickelodeon. And like, I had this Kickstarter, and that was it that I had to do. So I went, and then, you know, there were ups and downs. She was hospitalized for like a full month, and I was drawing at the hospital trying to get stuff, but at a slow speed. And then we found out she had tuberculosis, which is something that people don't normally get, but that you can also die from. So then she had to take this medication that was really hardcore. And like, you know, you take tuberculosis medication, your hair starts falling out and your face swells, and like, it just gets crazy. So like, it's been really hard to do this comic book stuff with all this going on. Now things are getting a little bit better, but then of course we're all dealing with the COVID-19 stuff and like all the craziness that's going on around the country. So I don't know, I guess I'm using this little part just to tell people who might watch this that supported me for the Kickstarter. I really appreciate your guys' help. I'm really sorry that this isn't done, but I haven't walked away from this. It's something I'm doing consistently. I want to get this out. You guys got the digital comic, so you know I drew it and I colored it and I inked it and I did everything. I posted photos of the books printed. I have them. I just have to finish the t-shirts and the art books. But right now also, it's this coronavirus thing. I need money to print these books and ship them out to everybody. So I'm trying to like get that stuff done too. It's been pretty hardcore. Like, I've had to like help my friend. So that's kind of like really taking a lot. But that being said, you know, that's life, I guess. You got to do stuff. But I will finish this thing. I'll do the art books and I'll send them out. So I appreciate everybody's support, and sorry it's taking this long, but that's what's going on with that. Sorry I took the time to do that. I just thought it'd be a good chance to talk about it. You guys
Jim?
are like, now.
see, like we're in our own coronavirus lockdown and stuff, and when Jimmy and I are together, we could usually tell by the others breathing if there's opportunity to jump in or not. So this is like a super new thing for us to be remotely doing these interviews, and I expected these little pauses and
all right.
And
yeah,
challenges.
I could talk. I won't. Just warning you so you don't worry. But like, I could talk about what's going on with the coronavirus and a lot of what's going on right now in this country for like a long time. But I won't. Just everybody, like, stay healthy. Take your vitamins A, B, D, and C. Get sunlight if possible, and move. Like, stretch, move your body. Like, don't let. Because this is what happened to me when I was in Japan working on comics, dude. I was inside. I got no sunlight. My diet wasn't great. I was stressed out, and I was indoors working. And, like, that will break your system down. So, guys, like eat fruits and vegetables, you know, like, stretch, you know, try to get some sunlight. Get your vitamin D. It's like your best way to get vitamin D is sunlight. We all need it. We all need it. The news, besides telling us to wear the masks so that we can all be safe and not, you know, catch stuff or spread it, they should also be telling us how to stay healthy while being indoors. Your diet, your sleep, your stress management, and all that stuff. Important. I already went through it in another scenario doing comic books. People need to, like, you know, they should be telling us that too, and they're not. So I'd like to take the time to tell you guys, stretch. You're sitting, you're drawing. We all love drawing. We all love doing this stuff. We live for this shit. And sometimes we give more importance to our actual work than ourselves. But yo, eat your fruits and vegetables and stretch. You need this. You can do more work that way. You have a longer career doing your comics and your stories if you can try to maintain your physical and mental health as well. Sorry, that was my PSA, guys.
It's good. It's very well said. We've said similar things early on whenever we were talking, giving the same advice of what we were doing while we were sitting at home, and it's much of the same. So
awesome.
I'm a believer in the exercise, diet, stress management all the time too, not just now. Good habits to apply to life in general, for sure. I have to kind of wrap up at this point.
We have to kind of wrap up at this point, man. It was a good conversation. It was
amazing.
Oh, thanks, guys.
Once again, this is not the Felipe Smith shoot interview. This is but one segment of a very inspiring and vast career, but it's an important segment to set apart from the inevitable future Felipe Smith shoot interview, because we had to get into deep depth on this subject. I'm fascinated with the culture. I'm fascinated by every step that you took to get to this place, to get to the place where you're out there in Japan doing that work. And I've been curious for a decade about every piece of that puzzle to make that happen. So this had to happen, you know, a nice 4-hour chunk talking about that specific thing. But Felipe, I hope that we can talk again in the future and do like the broad career stuff. And get into, you know, your American comics work deeper, you know, the Marvel stuff, and perhaps at that time, some of that NDA shit that you're bound by right now, man, we could talk about some of that as well.
Oh, hopefully that would be great. Yeah, if that happens next time we get a chance to talk, that would be awesome.
Yeah, and I want to revise one thing. You know, I had talked about PEEPO CHOO in the first part of this interview. I don't know if I described it as outlaw comics, but that's something that we celebrate a lot on this channel, and it's definitely an outlaw comic. So anybody that's you know, watching this and not familiar with it, I would add that adjective to it. It's an exciting vein of comics that is not to be taken for granted, and especially contemporary outlaw comics, I think, are few and far between. So in case I didn't make it clear last time, I do want to let our viewers know that. Definitely a comic to seek out if they appreciate that quality as well.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I feel honored. That's a great title.
We always you know, we talk that term outlaw comics, and we have our specific, you know, American versions of what we see as outlaw comics. But when you get into it, the real outlaw comics are Japanese. Fist of the North Star, a dude going like this on some guy's body and turning his body into cubes.
Yeah.
Like that's as outlaw as it gets, man. And Death Metal Zombie Cop has a lot of those attributes as well, man, which is definitely up the alley of our audience.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that's always been my thing too. I told that to my editor when I started out, because he kept telling me there was a pattern. Comics have changed in Japan considerably, especially the outlaw factor of it recently. And I realized that now that you're saying that, I never understood why, but my editor told me, hey, like, you're crazy with the violence here. And People Chew has a lot of that. And he found it amusing. Like, he would chuckle and he would look at me and shake his head. And he'd be like, just, what, you're, like, he would tell me, you're stupid. He would just say, omae baka da na. And omae is like, it's a friendly way of referring to someone. It's like the opposite of the usted, like the honorific. It's like talking down to you, but it's because I like you that much, I can talk to you that way. And he's like, you know, my superior in age and in rank and in experience in life, right? But he's like, you're dumb. And it was like a compliment, because he finds that people who can just do that type of stuff without worrying about it, because they just because they think it's funny, it could fall flat or whatever, you know. And then the other thing, and I told him, like, but I mean, I learned this from seeing Japanese comics. Like, you guys make this shit. Like, I saw Fist of the North Star for the first time as a kid on VHS, and it blew my mind. People would change sizes just out of nowhere. Like, a guy was a huge villain, and he was like, you know, 40 feet tall. And, you know, and he would catch people with his mouth as they're like diving at him, attacking. And he was a normal human being. He wasn't that big, but that moment was showing you how fearsome of an opponent this guy is, that it made you that scary. Like, you were figuratively showing literal craziness, you know? And I told him, like, I got this from Japan, and I named a bunch of comic books that have this stuff. And he just kind of chuckled and shook his head, and he's like, yeah, like, he's like, in the 90s, comics in Japan were very different, and people were really pushing it like that. But he said things have gotten softer now over here. So the kind of stuff that you're doing right now is really shocking to some people here, believe it or not. And I thought it was crazy, because I just thought I was doing normal stuff. But, you know, there's fads, things change. So I like that term, though, outlaw. Outlaw comics. Maybe that's my genre, dude.
All right, we'll leave it at that. All of your social media links will be in the description below this video, as well as part 1. Riveting conversation, and thanks for taking the time, Felipe.
All right, thanks a lot, guys. Always a pleasure.